Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our last and final first aid webinar as part of our first aid series. Thank you for joining us. And this presentation is all about new requirements for first aid drills and how to set up your team to ace the drills. However, you can't ace the drills without training your team on what to do and how to do it. So we're going to throw some training in there too. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm grateful to be joining you from my home office in Kelowna that's located on the traditional unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan people, including the West Bank First Nation and the Okanagan Indian Band, where I have the honor to live, work, and play. We'd also like to acknowledge that the GoToHR office is located in Vancouver on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and that our work across BC takes place on the traditional unceded territories of 203 distinct nations. We pay respect to these nations and are grateful to live, work, travel, and play on these lands and waters of BC's Indigenous peoples. As you may remember, I'm Lonnie, this is Simi, and in order to introduce ourselves without repeating ourselves from the previous 2 weeks, Simi and I have another interesting fact about our histories with health and safety from our past to keep things fresh and new. So if you're with us for webinar number 3, you'll know my name is Lonnie. But just to recap, I'm one of the industry health and safety specialists with GoToHR. And this week's fun fact about me is that I recently completed a certificate in OH&S at BCIT, which greatly complements my work experience in the tourism, health and safety realm. So Simi, would you like to share your fun fact?
Thank you, Lonnie, and welcome everyone. Glad to be here for our final first aid webinar.
Woo.
Um, so yeah, I'm Simi, the other health and safety specialist. A fun safety fact, maybe not so fun, is that last year I made my entire family go through basic first aid training after my dad accidentally choked on a piece of chicken at the dinner table. So
Oh.
only my cousin and I knew what to do while everyone else was screaming and panicking. So it was a bit scary, but a good moment, like good learning moment for all of us. So
Wow, yeah, totally. Okay, let's move on with our who are we? We won't get into this too much, but just a reminder, we're GoToHR, both the HR and the Health and Safety Association that supports the tourism and hospitality industry in health and safety, HR training and research and strategy in order to drive those strong workforces and safe workplaces that deliver world-class tourism and hospitality experiences in BC. So if you're not already familiar with us, I encourage you to go explore gotohr.ca, where you'll find a variety of resources and support available for you to make your lives easier, or get in touch and we'll discuss our offerings with you. Our services and online resources are free for you to download, customize, and a lot of our training offerings are free as well. So be sure to check those out online or let us know if you have any questions, and we're always here to help. So to recap from last week, we explored what is required to be included in our first aid procedures and covered how we can best integrate those into our existing procedures. We also talked about some of those industry best practices that can elevate and enhance our first aid programs, such as integrating that health and safety consideration aspect pre and post incident, and then also which helps control the impact of the workplace injury on the whole team, not just the injured worker. So if you've missed that last week's session or even the first webinar in our series, I highly encourage you to go back and watch the recordings of those. These recordings and resources from all 3 webinars are available online, so you should be able to receive an email with the link and the recording and the resources. But if you haven't received that, please do check your junk email folder. Sometimes our emails get filed away automatically. And then we also encourage you to add GoToHR to your safe senders list so they come through into the right folder. If for some reason it hasn't come through and you'd like to access those recordings and the resources, please email safety@gotohr.ca and they will be sent to you. So thank you for those who followed up from our previous sessions. Hopefully you have what you need now. And the recordings and the resources from this session should be posted and sent out by Friday of this week. So thank you for your patience, and we look forward to getting you what you need in order to make the smooth transition come November 1st. So the countdown is on, less than 2 weeks until November 1st. And though that implementation date is November 1st, we pulled the group last week to see if there was interest in doing a workshop session, diving into the details about the first aid assessments. And so happy to announce that we will be hosting 3 different first aid assessment workshops, one for ski and other recreation employers, one for accommodation employers, and then one for restaurant employers, all in the first 2 weeks of November. So we'll pop those registration links into the chat, as well as include it in our post-webinar email. So if you'd like to join us for one of those, we'd love to have you. So in true workshop fashion, though, those are going to be more a collaborative session. So bring your ideas, bring your thinking caps, and we'll tackle those first aid assessments together. Okay, now for our presentation today. Like I said, we're going to spend some time chatting about training requirements, and then we'll also move into those drill requirements, which is a new exciting requirement with the new regulation. So we'll then look at some special considerations, both general considerations and industry-specific considerations for when you're building and conducting drills. We'll go through some of the steps of what it looks like to plan a drill, what we like to call drill building. And then we'll walk through an example and some different ideas on what you can incorporate into your drills. And then lastly, we'll go over the resources and support that are available to you at no cost once again. So this week we should have some time to answer some questions. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. You can view each other's questions, upvote them if you're wondering the same thing. If it makes sense to answer the question within the session, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll get to it at the end. If your question didn't get answered during the call, don't worry, we'll include it, any answerable questions in the Q&A that's posted on the recordings and resources page sent out to you on Friday. So again, if you can please make sure your questions are easy to understand, and we'll do our best to answer them appropriately. So let's get started, Simi. Over to you with, oh, just kidding. This is me. It's my turn. We're going to talk about training. So why start with training, and what kind of training are we talking about? So we are talking about workplace-specific training that you provide for your workers, your first aid attendants, and what we're calling our transportation assistance in order for our first aid procedures to be successful. So just to clarify, we're not talking about the CSA standardized first aid certification that your first aid attendants should be getting to provide care to an injured worker. If you have questions regarding that as well, we can try to answer those today or post-webinar. But for now, we're going to focus on explaining the site-specific training requirements that are required in the regulation and what extra detail WorkSafeBC has provided in the guideline for that. So remember last week when Simi explained the difference between the regulation and the guideline? So that still applies, okay? So you need to focus on meeting the requirement listed in the regulation, and then the guideline is there as well to help us execute that requirement. So again, we find ourselves in OHS regulation part 3, section 17 and 21 that explains the training requirements. So to set up everybody for success in a drill or even in a real life incident, people need to know what they're supposed to do. Okay, it's the same with any emergency response plan or ERP. Same for if there was a fire in the building or some sort of evacuation. People need to have that pre-incident understanding of what they need to do, what they're supposed to do when something bad happens. So when it comes to workplace injuries, there's a few different groups that we can break this down into. So first of all, workers, all workers. All workers need to know what they need to do if they're the ones injured, if they get injured at work, or if they witness an injury and they need help. So how do they summon first aid? You'll remember back to last week when we made our first aid procedures, and how to summon first aid should be a part of that procedure. So another way to look at it is that you're just training your workers on another safe work procedure, how to call for first aid. It's called out in the regulation that you must post the procedures in a suitable location. So as we mentioned last week, a good place for these to be posted is on the safety notice boards or by, phones or radios, those communication devices that they're going to use in order to call for first aid. Secondly, the first aid attendants need to be trained specifically on their workplace procedures, including the following items: how to best provide first aid at your work site. So the procedures we spoke about last week, especially if minor and major injuries get slightly different responses. So just to remind you, if a worker has a minor injury and they're able to meet that first aid attendant at the first aid room or the dressing station versus the first aid attendant going to the injury location for a major injury where the patient shouldn't be moved. Again, completing first aid records, those making medical referrals, having that first aid decision-making authority, and the transfer of care are all other topics that you should be training your first aid attendants on. That's site-specific. So executing this training shouldn't be too difficult, though, because they should all be found where? In your first aid procedures that we made last week. Okay, so before moving on as well, there is a group of staff that I'd like to talk about here that we're calling transportation assistants. And that's a Lonnie word. That's not something WorkSafe really came up with, but the transportation assistants. So the transportation of patients is ultimately the responsibility of the first aid attendants. However, non-certified workers can help that first aid attendant move the patient when more hands are needed. So either by manually stabilizing them while walking to the first aid or to the ambulance, or by helping carrying a stretcher that a injured worker is in, or by driving the ETV or a snowmobile when transporting a patient from a more secluded area of your resort, for example. So not to be confused with the transportation endorsement required by some first aid attendants. These transportation assistants just need training on their part of the process. So for example, if they drive a snowmobile or a golf cart for maintenance purposes usually, and they're going to be used to transport injured workers if and when they get injured, the snowmobile or golf cart driver should know how the processes differ from one another. So whether it's specific routes that need to be taken or the max speed limit is lowered during the transportation of an injured worker, or the communication during transportation as well. So like the communication procedures, all of those need to be trained and considered when you're setting up those transportation assistants for success in their roles. So I encourage you to explore that side of your first aid procedures and train your transportation assistants accordingly as well. Now that we've identified who needs to be trained and briefly identified what needs to be included, let's talk about when and how for training. So training should be conducted during onboarding, so more of that orientation style training, and then also having those seasonal refreshers. So throughout the season, just refreshing the process in workers' minds, so that they make sure that they remember how they are to summon first aid or some of those other procedures we just talked about. So training methods that can be used could be reading the manual, reviewing the manual as a group. You know, you could conduct a tabletop exercise or do practice scenarios. Really anything that includes the responsibilities or the procedural steps to help them understand that. Safety talks are another really good way to do that throughout the season. Essentially, you want to introduce the first aid procedure, build up their knowledge by identifying their responsibilities within the procedure, and then ensuring they know their role by checking their knowledge or testing their knowledge. Another key consideration to think about when you're planning things, planning training, is how to record the training. So are you using orientation checklists, one per person? Are you using a group training log template? Safety talks always have a record of who was there and the brief description of what was covered. So those are really easy to use as training records. Another good question to ask yourself is there a way for you to follow up on training after it's completed? So if there's questions that came up during the training that you needed a little extra clarification on, are you going to follow up with those individuals or include it in the procedure for future training? If you've got a complex workplace with multiple departments and you're delegating training to different department managers and you're getting them to complete the training logs and giving them back to you, are you auditing those training logs for completion and ensuring all workers from each department have been trained properly? That's another really key consideration when we're talking about recording training and making sure that everybody's trained properly. So there's a lot of things to think about when doing training. So I hope this helps a little bit to organize how to prepare for training, especially those first aid procedures. And like I said previously, the best way to ace a drill is to be properly trained in the first place. So now that we've gone through all of that, Simi's going to talk to us about the new drill requirements.
Awesome. Thank you, Lonnie. Yeah, so now I'll launch into an overview of what exactly will be required in your drills. So next slide, Lonnie.
A little slow
You're
there.
breathing.
There he goes.
No, as long as it works. Yeah, so to start off here, according to OHS Regulation 3.17, a first aid drill is required to be conducted at least once annually or whenever a procedural change occurs. The drill will be used to determine if the procedures are effective and if workers, your first aid attendants and transportation assistants, if they're capable of fulfilling their responsibilities. So for example, some of those responsibilities for your first aid attendants could include if they can follow appropriate first aid procedures, depending on the nature of the injury, if it's minor or if it's serious, and ensuring that necessary emergency services or support are being contacted. For worker responsibilities, that could look like testing to see if they are able to report the simulated injury to the nearest supervisor or the first aid attendant. So how quickly they're able to do that, and also helping to control the area to ensure that the safety of others, of any bystanders, um, they're being kept safe, and to prevent any additional incidents from occurring. And then maybe for the transportation assistance, their responsibilities could look like coordinating any transportation needs, ensuring any equipment like a stretcher or a wheelchair is ready for use, and then also just assisting the first aid attendant in securing the worker for transport. Um, and then, yes, and the next slide, Lonnie. So for the drill requirements here, so for 3.17 in the guidelines, it gives a little bit more guidance on executing drills, including providing any opportunities for those involved to practice their responsibilities. So again, those workers, those first aid attendants, those transportation assistants, and just to identify and resolve any potential challenges or deficiencies in those written procedures. So if there's any challenges with communication or any transportation barriers. So mock scenarios should be developed to allow for evaluation of these six procedural factors that are called out in the guidelines. So just to go over them briefly here. So the first one is you want to assess the ability of the first aid attendants and the transportation assistants to access any equipment, supplies, and first aid facilities. You want to assess the worker's familiarity with how to call for first aid and the location of first aid equipment and supplies, and how effectively the first aid attendant can be summoned and how they can respond to those minor and serious injuries, and how effectively an injured worker can be accessed and moved. So to test those transportation barriers, both on-site and to medical aid. And then also looking at how effectively an injured worker can be prepared or packaged and transported to an area that is accessible to BCEHS, if that's applicable to your workplace. And then finally, you want to assess if first aid attendants are familiar with documentation and their reporting requirements. Back to you, Lonnie.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about some of those extra considerations. So that's a great overview of the drill requirements. But as we know, there's some special considerations both in the general way of speaking and the industry specific way of speaking that are worth mentioning. So let's talk about the general ones first. Okay, so drills should be designed in such a way that it does not pose any undue hazards or to worker safety, the public, or first aid attendants participating in the drills. So feel free to use dummies to simulate the injured worker when you're testing or simulating transportation methods, especially if they're new methods and you're not quite sure how they'll go. So it's included in the WorkSafe literature that you can use a tabletop drill as well when undue hazards to workers exist, if that will allow for an effective evaluation of the procedure. A couple other things for general considerations is that you cannot simply review a real incident requiring first aid in place of a drill. So WorkSafeBC won't accept that as a drill. And then also don't actually initiate external resources for your drill. So calling 911 in a drill is not advised by WorkSafeBC. So only initiate them in a real scenario. And if you're curious of what their response could be, calling the non-emergency line or taking that ICS or Instant Command System 100 may be a great way to learn more about what their response may look like and how you can integrate that and best work with them to provide the best care for your injured workers or your injured guests for that matter as well. Now, within our industry, we have some special considerations that are necessary to mention during this time as well. So some of which are listed on your screen now. However, with each workplace being different, you'll probably have something slightly different, some slight different considerations to factor in to your training and your drills. So first off, guest interactions. And I'm just going to list off a bunch of questions essentially to get your mind thinking. So are you doing a drill during operating hours? So maybe you work at a hotel and there's no non-operational hours. So how are you going to manage the first aid drill? Can you do it in a staff only area? Can you give guests a heads up of when and how and what the drill is, how the drill is taking place? Can you maybe combine a first aid drill and a fire drill? So that might be a little bit more complex and more challenging for your team, but then you get it all done at once. Staff experience. So are there new and young workers on your team, foreign workers, seasonal workers? Do you have a lot of volunteers on site, and how do they play into your procedures, and who's taking care of them while an emergency happens? And all of those types of questions can be asked in that bubble. And weather. So whether it's rain or snow, cold weather, hot weather, we experience all of that in our province. So are you taking those into consideration? Are you providing ice or cold packs as well as warmth generating items like hot water bottles or free hot chocolate to bystanders or witnesses to ensure their basic human needs are met? The worst thing is if you have one injured person and then you didn't take care of the rest of the group, and then now you have 3 or 4 injured people because the weather took over and made things worse for them. Seasonal fluctuations as well. So if your staffing levels change throughout the year, so should your procedures potentially from summer to winter. So make sure that you take those into consideration when you're doing your training and your drills of your first aid procedures. Events also. So events is a big one. How do the procedures change if you're running an event and a staff member gets injured? And lastly, remote location. So if you're in a remote location, what does your on-site transportation look like? And then plus that second stage of transportation. Does it look different to summer to winter? Can you use a snowmobile in the summer? You can't really use a snowmobile in the summer, so you have to kind of come up with a different plan. So I'm just trying to get you to think about those industry specific considerations so you're not caught off guard during those actual first aid emergencies. So you can also brainstorm some of these considerations with your safety committee and see what they say if they have anything to add. Another good way to look for some of these industry specific considerations is in that second step of your first aid assessment. And Simi's going to walk through some of that practical drill building with us now, and I'm sure she'll mention some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Lonnie. Yeah, so now we will move on to some guidance on how to go about building out a drill for your workplace, and also going over an example of how building out a drill for your workplace might look like. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so these are the general steps you would want to take in order to develop an effective drill. So first, you would want to start off by reviewing your first aid assessments and procedures, just to identify any specific elements that should be included. For example, if your assessment determines that you need an intermediate first aid attendant and basic first aid attendant, you want to ensure that the coordination of the two attendants is going to be tested in your drill. In the second step, you would want to review any previous injury reports in your workplace. So looking at your first aid records, any incident reports, and data trends to identify any injuries that should be tested or should be built into your scenario, and based on the severity and likelihood of that injury occurring in your workplace. And if it's applicable to your workplace, you can also review your workplace's emergency response plan and to integrate those key components into the drill. So kind of coordinating the response between that emergency response team and the first aid attendants. In the last step, you will want to develop a drill plan. So this would involve the following. So choosing a date and time that works for your operation. So maybe that's during your regular work hours. Developing a scenario that is specific to your workplace and consider different scenarios for major injuries, minor injuries, areas that are less accessible to BCEHS, and then recruiting scenario participants. So you need to consider who's going to play the role of the injured person, who's going to be the reporting party, the bystanders. Are you going to have an observer to take notes on the drill? So it's good to kind of assign those roles in advance. Um, the plan should also include how the date and time will be communicated to the workers, the attendants, and the transportation assistants. So maybe you're letting them know that a drill is going to be happening on a certain date, but maybe you're not going to let them know about the exact scenario and leave that as a surprise to simulate a real event. And then the plan should also mention that the drill will be executed on the date and that there will be a debrief following the drill. And remember to include any provisions for documenting the drills. So you want to maybe assign someone who will be in charge of this. Okay, so moving on to a example of how to build out a drill. So first we want to review our first aid assessment or our procedure. In our first webinar, we conducted a mock first aid assessment for Lonnie's Hotel. And in the second part of the assessment, we covered additional factors that need to be considered for the workplace. So based on those additional factors, we can build out some components for our drill. So for example, we had put down that lacerations and burn injuries are common at Lonnie's Hotel. So, and we base that off of our first aid records. So, and then we'd also put down that not everyone carries a radio on the site. So it's important to take this into consideration when developing a drill. So we would want to conduct a drill for workers who do carry a radio and for those who don't to test the communication and the response times. Another factor that was noted was that the hotel property is quite large, so that it can take the first aid attendant some time to reach the injured person. So I would maybe need to consider timing how long it takes the first aid attendant to arrive at different locations on the property during the drill. And you may find that you maybe have to train additional workers or assign backup first aid responders in different areas of the property to reduce any response time when that primary attendant is quite far away. So I mentioned that you can review your workplace injury trends by looking at your first aid records and incident reports to see what kind of injuries are occurring and developing scenarios around that. So I'm sharing this for the employers who might have more of a difficult time coming up with scenarios if they don't have too many like workplace injury data to go off of, if they don't have a lot of first aid records. So WorkSafeBC has a tool where you can look up stats on injuries based on our industry and your classification unit number. So in the picture here, I've selected the CU number for Lonnie's Hotel, which falls under overnight and short-term accommodation. So here you can see that what type of injuries are most typical for our workplace. So in this case, I would note down that overexertion is a common accident type, which can lead to injuries related to strain, and I can develop a scenario based on this. And then thanks, Lonnie. And then, so remember, we also want to conduct drills for responding to major and serious injuries as well. So there is another tool for that as well, similar to the previous one that I showed. So if we look at the second picture here, of serious injuries in tourism and hospitality. We can see that fractures and lacerations are two of the top injuries, and the immediate cause of the injuries in this industry is often falls on the same level, or also known as slip, trips, and falls. So again, this is another scenario that you can use to develop using this information. And next slide. So here I have created a a sample of a drill report form, where the first half can be used to plan out a drill, and the second half can be used as part of the debrief of the drill. And I want to emphasize that this is just an example, and this may look a little different from workplace to workplace. So this is just meant to get you started, and then also WorkSafeBC will be coming out with tools to kind of help you a little bit more with this. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so looking at the sample form of the first day drill report, which can also be used for planning. So what we want to include here is the date and time of the drill. So it's a good idea to specify the shift during which the drill is going to be conducted to ensure that your records show that the drills were conducted for different shifts, and to make sure as many employees are included as possible, and to account for factors such as peak operating hours or site or shift specific risks. So for example, during the night shift, there may be lower visibility or reduced supervision. So just to make sure those factors are accounted for. The location of the drill. So for example, if you're a hotel, you may want to conduct a drill in different areas, such as the kitchen, different floors of the hotel, the lobby, the pool. Just make sure to be specific about the location of where that drill is being conducted. The names and roles of the participants, which I already kind of went over. So your participants typically would be your attendants, general workers. Maybe you want to involve your supervisors or managers, safety committee members, and if applicable, your emergency response team to test the collaboration with your first aid attendants. And then you also want to have a section for your brief summary of the scenario that was conducted. So again, just be sure to come up with those scenarios for the major injuries and minor injuries.
Perfect. Before we go on to the next slide, we have a few questions that I think we can answer quickly in here. So one is, can the drill report template that Simi is using be shared? And so yes, we'll include that in the resources for sure. And then another one is, if we have a restaurant at our hotel, do we need to complete separate drills for the restaurant, or is one drill enough for both the hotel and the restaurant?
Um, I would say separate drills for
Yeah,
the two different locations.
yeah, that would probably be best, because it would be most beneficial to the workers in each of those locations to have something within that location. Is there a requirement by WorkSafeBC to have more than one drill? No, however, there is a requirement by WorkSafe to have all of that tested. So if you can test, if you think you can test all within one drill, by all means, but if you feel like you need to split them out, then that's what I would do probably.
Yeah, and just to consider the type of injuries that are occurring in the kitchen versus um like the hotel, the injuries might be different. So you might want to test the response to the injuries. Like if your first aid attendant, how they're going to respond to the injuries. So just good practice
Yeah,
to maybe do those two separate ones.
yeah. Okay, we'll continue on for now.
Okay, awesome. So, in addition to the first part of the report, the following component should also be included after you've executed your drill. So, a summary of your observations and outcomes. So, including what went well and any deficiencies. If any deficiencies were identified, then any corrective actions that need to be taken. Those should also be documented, including the completion date. If any deficiencies or challenges are identified, you may need to modify your first aid procedures. And once those significant deficiencies are fixed, it would be a good idea to test those procedures once again. And the results of the drill should be shared with all your staff, including your attendants and the Joint Health and Safety Committee, or a worker rep if you're a smaller employer. So they're also able to review the outcomes of the drill and offer their input. And refresher training should also be conducted for those that are going to be affected by any of those modified first aid procedures. Um, And also just want to mention that, so while conducting drills is important, documenting your first aid drills is also very important, and keeping a record, it ensures compliance with regulations. So keeping a record of your drills should be maintained as part of your first aid program.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, you saying that made me think of one thing. When WorkSafe officers come around for inspections, they might ask for that record of the drill being completed. So in order to provide that record is a way to show them that you've actually completed a record. If it's not written down, you can't really say that it happened, right?
Yep, exactly. Um, okay, so in my drill report form, I included a checklist at the bottom to make sure that I've assessed for the 6 procedural factors in order just to keep me on track. But it will be up to you on how you want to set, how you guys want to set this up for your report form. You may decide to include an observation section for each of the 6 procedural factors if you want to be more thorough. But I'll go over each procedural factor in a little bit more detail to give everyone a better idea of what to assess for. So to start off with the accessibility to equipment and supplies. So you want to be evaluating whether your first aid attendants and transportation assistants can quickly access those first aid kits, equipment, the first aid room, they know how to quickly locate it. This also includes checking the availability of your supplies, like dressing, cooling agents, any splints. So making sure that the necessary supplies to treat a specific injury, are there. And then the workers' familiarity with emergency procedures. So you want to assess how well workers know the process for calling for first aid, and whether they're aware of the locations of first aid kits and station, and they know how to contact first aid. They know where to find that information. And then you want to test how quickly workers can locate and summon first aid attendants when an incident occurs. First aid attendant response. So you want to examine how efficiently first aid attendants are summoned, maybe your timing list, and their ability to respond to both minor and more serious injuries. Um, and then yeah, and then you can also check to see if attendants are following the proper assessment and treatment protocols as well. If they conducted a scene assessment before they attended to the worker. So all these things you can assess for. Transportation and assessment of the injured worker. So you want to test how smoothly an injured worker can be moved to a safe area. And you want to consider those potential transportation barriers. So if there's any narrow passageways or stairways within the workplace. So just to see how smoothly that the transportation assistant can help out during those situations. And then you want to evaluate the process of preparing the injured worker for transport, so either within the facility or for external medical assistance, and whether barriers like terrain or access routes are going to present any issues. If applicable, coordination with BCEHS. So if the workplace involves external medical aid, you want to assess how well the injured is going to be prepared and moved to an accessible area for emergency responders by your transportation assistance. And finally, familiarity with documentation and reporting. So you want to ensure that your first aid attendants are familiar with the required documentation and the reporting process for your workplace. So including filling out any incident reports or any first aid records following the drill. I'll hand it back over to you, Lonnie.
Thank you. And while I go over some of the drill ideas, there's a Q&A about that Microsoft BI. So if you can maybe provide a link to that
Sure.
for that person, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So thanks for walking us through that example, Simi. We also wanted to give you some other examples of drill scenarios that we've either seen in the past or that are unique or common for our industry and sectors. So I just developed these off the top of my head, essentially. So just to give you some some ideas. I'd like to read them out loud, and I'll also highlight some of those additional considerations that could be included or tested during the drills. And so for accommodation, the first one there is housekeeper sprain their wrist while competitively vacuuming from repetitively vacuuming. And so you have a repetitive strain there. So you got return to work considerations could be tested. So does the first aid attendant know how to initiate that return to work rather than sending them to medical aid? The second one, maintenance worker got chemicals in their eye, so your eye wash stations locations can be tested, as well as the availability of the SDS binders for specific chemicals. A groundskeeper broke their leg falling from a ladder, so if they're working alone, the work alone procedures and the communication channels can be tested, as well as the first aid attendant's ability to find someone maybe in a more obscure place on site. So they have to find the person on site rather than, just, oh, they're at the front desk or they're at the first aid room. You can kind of like do a bit of a hunt for them. And then for the food and beverage people in the room, your bartender pulled their back switching kegs over. So again, a soft tissue injury during a busy operating time. So what are you going to do when you have service to upkeep while your first aid attendant does first aid and one of your key positions is out of commission? Another one, a server broke their wrist slipping on a wet floor. So maybe your server doesn't have the greatest English speaking skills. So how is your first aid attendant going to navigate that? They need to go to the hospital. So how do you transport them? What's the ideal scenario for that transportation? Is it getting a family friend to pick them up, or are you driving them? Are you calling an ambulance? Anytime you call an ambulance, and we can talk about this a little bit more later, but anytime you call an ambulance, there is a cost associated with that. So if you're able to, if the injury is stable and it's more of a minor injury, and they're ambulatory, then you can drive them there, but you might want to call an ambulance depending on the injury. Our third example there in the food and beverage section is a chef cutting their finger while chopping veggies. So another one during operating hours, how are you going to manage those competing priorities? Food safe would also be a consideration. Do we have to throw out everything that he was working on? Is it a cut that can be managed on site, or do they need to go to the hospital? All of those questions can be answered during some of these specific drills per sector, per department. So just to reiterate back what we said about doing a first aid drill in the restaurant of a hotel, some of those more specific considerations for each department would then be able to get tested. And then lastly, my favorite place to be, the ski hill. So snowshoe guide gets a concussion during the spring snowshoe tour because a snow bomb fell from a tree and hit them on the head. Okay, so now you have a group of participants in a remote location with a leader that needs assistance, probably a leader who needs to be replaced with someone else. You have to transport that worker back to the first aid hut potentially, so you can test the transportation from your snowshoe trails. Weather conditions may also be a factor there. So what is it if it's poor visibility, those types of things? Maybe it's even a evening snowshoe tour, so you don't have the daylight to make transportation easier. My second ski example there is a patroller broke their finger in the drill when they were putting up a rope line. So now you have a first aid attendant who is the one that needs first aid. So hopefully there's more than one patroller on site who can provide that support for that person, but they need to go to the hospital. So if there isn't another first aid attendant to stay behind and look after the rest of the staff, the rest of the operation, what needs to happen? Do you need to call somebody in? Do you need to shut down operations or suspend operations until a first aid attendant or another patroller is on site? So those types of things you got to be thinking of when you're putting your drills together. Make it a little bit complex. Test it. That's the whole point of doing drills, right? And finally, in our ski hill section there, we have a snow school instructor that hurt their back lifting a child onto the chairlift. So how do they call for help when they're out on the slopes? Do all ski instructors carry their cell phone with them? Do they have radios? Does patrol go to them? Can their supervisor get dispatched at the same time to take over their group while the worker gets appropriate first aid that they need? All of these different things need to be considered when you're doing a drill. So it's not just, oh, so and so Sally hurt her wrist. Okay, now let's do it. Test your procedures, get creative, come up with some of your own. Creating these types of examples is a great way or a great exercise for your safety committee to assist with. They know the hazards that they face every day in their departments, in their workspace. So use their minds to help come up with some drill ideas. Okay, so now that we've gone through all of that, we're going to talk about some of the resources and support that we have available for training and drills. And yeah, just what we can provide for you guys when it comes to that. So here we have some online resources. Obviously, there's some Q&A there that will get answered here. But yeah, we'll have that one pager on first aid drills. So kind of summarizing what we just covered will be available for you. The drill record as well that Simi has put together. So that'll be available. Now, some of these things, right, like they're just one idea. So the drill record, this isn't the one that you should live, die, and breathe this drill record. You can make your own. WorkSafe is also going to potentially come out with a drill record that you can use. So all of these are just supports or resources for you to use and maybe take and customize for yourself as well. We have an orientation checklist that lists some of those, how to get first aid and all those types of things for general workers. So that'll be included on the online resources. The group training log will also be there. And the OHS guidelines and regulation from WorkSafe is also there. So this QR code takes you to the first aid recordings, webinar recordings, and resources. So you should be able to scan that and you'll see all three. Well, after today, the third one will be posted, but all three webinar recordings, as well as all the resources that we've gone over these past 3 weeks, is part of that QR code. And so all of the recordings live all on the same page. So you only need one link. You don't need 3 different links. So check out that link, and we'll also send it out on Friday to all 3 webinars. The whole series will be available in that one link. One-on-one support. So we've expanded our first aid consultation services from only being the assessment walkthrough to actually also including the procedural development, helping you review your procedure as well. And then that's all from last week. And then this week, the drill development and review or post-drill deficiency correction. So if you are looking to create a drill, we can help you develop that or go through those steps of like determining what your scenario should be and all of that kind of stuff. If you do that and you just want us to review it, we can do that as well. If you do a drill and you see so many deficiencies and you're like, I don't know where to start, we can also help you correct those deficiencies. So identify different ways of mitigation for those. If you're not looking for a full-blown consultation, but simply just have a question, please submit your questions and we'll answer what we can and include what we can on the Q&A PDF that will be on that resources and recordings page as well. So keep checking back to that. It'll be a downloadable PDF, the Q&A, but we'll continue adding to it as we get more questions and as this rolls out over the next couple of months. Okay, so is there any questions that we can talk about, Simi? You're muted.
I don't see any in the Q&A box there, but there is one in the chat.
Okay.
It's are there protocols if no one witnesses the injury?
That would be a site-specific protocol, as well as first aid specific protocols. So in CSA, in first aid, when you learn how to do first aid, for instance, for CPR, there's specific guidance for if you stumble upon someone who needs CPR or is on the ground unconscious. So that's not something that we can really advise on. So your first aid attendants should know that if it does change at all. I think for like basic first aid attendants, they treat them all the same. But for EMR and some of the higher level first aid attendants, they'll know some additional considerations for if it's unwitnessed or witnessed. But yeah, that should be included within your procedures. So this is kind of where working alone and first aid procedures kind of collide, right? So if you're able to ensure that anybody working alone doing dangerous tasks or doing hazardous things has that check-in procedure, you'll be able to come upon that person quicker, I would say, rather than just having them do a task without those check-ins and then be 5 hours later being like, oh, we were supposed to, so and so went to cut down that tree, have we ever heard from them after that? And then you're 5 hours in and he potentially is injured without that check-in. So if you want to talk more about that first aid procedures and work alone procedures, get in touch with me, and yeah, we can do that offline.
Awesome. Thank you, Lonnie. Um, Also, another good question that maybe we can address here is what are the best ways to refresh training throughout the season?
Ooh, good question. I like that one. Okay, so there's a few different things you can do. You could include a safety talk that you could prepare. The one thing I will say is it's always good at the beginning of the season to prepare some of those materials that you're going to use mid-season. So if mid-season you have to put together some training thing, whether it's an in-person session, whether it's a email that goes out to everybody, or whether it's a safety talk template, all those types of things. If you do that pre-season, that will set you up for success mid-season, because then you can just kind of grab and go. So yeah, various things can be used. The safety talks are a really good example. Sending out a memo, doing another way that I like to do it is if I can add some questions to our inspection forms. So when in the case that I was, our joint health and safety committee members would walk around and ask, oh, if I'm going to a different department, I ask just a random person, random worker, if you needed first aid, what would you do? And then that creates some conversation, and it's kind of like unsolicited, right? Oh, I don't know what I would do. Or maybe it catches those mid-season hires of not knowing what to do or where to go for first aid. Hopefully that helps.
Totally. Um, Another question, maybe we might need more details or we can follow up, is can I include holders of standard first aid with CPR level A or C on our first aid attendance list?
Yeah, please follow up with us on that, and we'll look at because it all depends on where you fall within the Schedule 3A. So follow up with us if you have more questions on that, and we can talk about that offline.
A common one that we've been getting is, are we required to create this drill and conduct it before the November 1st amendment date there?
That's a hard one for me to answer. I don't necessarily know if a WorkSafe officer is going to come by it and say on November 1st, show me your drill log. I don't think that will happen. But doing it, getting them in place, doing a drill as soon as possible is probably a good idea.
Yeah, I think if you're showing that you have a process in place of, developing a drill, you have plans to conduct it, it's a good start.
Hmm. Yep.
Um, so this one is more of a employer specific question, but we got time, so maybe we can address it. So
Sure.
we are a golf course and have temporary construction due to the implementation of irrigation. Would this change our workplace hazard rating as there is open excavation, but is temporary?
So I'm going to broaden this question out and maybe address it when it comes to having those contractors or subcontractors and who's in charge and who's responsible for having that first aid and addressing that first aid challenge. So the main contractor would be in charge and responsible for providing that first aid or making sure that the first aid is available for those workers. I I think when you do your assessment, when you're talking about changing a hazard rating, that's when I would implement or factor in that activity outside our classic or our typical CU. So that's where I would probably put that in. As well, then you might have to add something to your procedure when it comes to that, how that extra consideration of that open excavation. However, because your first aid assessment is done whenever a significant operational change happens, once that open excavation is done or once that construction is done, as you say, it's temporary, then you can go back to your regular procedure. So it might be an extra consideration that you have to include, but it also might be something that isn't your responsibility, but that still needs to be done.
Awesome, Lonnie. Um, we have a question in the chat. So, do these drills have to be in person, or can you do videos with questions throughout the video? So throughout maybe like an online session.
Yeah, I think it depends on what your organization looks like. Like if everyone's on site, then yeah, it's probably best to do one in person, especially with going to the first aid room and getting first aid. I know for some tour companies, say where they have drivers all over BC, that's not really going to be like doable or practicable. So I can understand if you're in that sort of situation wanting to do one virtually. And so yeah, I would consider from my experience and my I mean, I'm not answering for WorkSafe, so we might want to question that. But I think if you're able to make it work as a drill for your organization, then I think that that would be fine.
Yep.
One of the questions here in the Q&A is, will the regulation be part of this year's core audit? And I would assume so, yeah, because that's the core audit. I don't know. Yeah, I would say yes as a short answer. We have 3 minutes left, 2.5 probably. So let's do 2 more questions. Pick your favorites there, Simi, and then we'll call it. And the rest of the questions, again, just to reiterate, will be included in the Q&A and sent out by Friday with the rest of the 3 recordings for all 3 webinars and all the resources attached as well.
Right. I think we do have just 2 more questions there, but they might be a little bit specific to the workplace there. But one is my colleague has 2 jobs where he has emergency first aid. Can we consider him to be certified for our work? He has it from the local fire department.
So WorkSafeBC requires all of the first aid certifications to be CSA standard as well as approved by them. So there is a link, and it's also included, we'll include it in the resources, but to a PDF where WorkSafe has listed all of the approved first aid training providers. So as long as he meets those requirements, he can be your first aid attendant as well, yeah.
Yep. Awesome. And our final question from Larissa. So are tenants that rent space in a hotel responsible for their own drills?
Do you know the answer to that, Simi?
Hmm.
I like getting some of these
Yeah.
questions because
Right?
they
Yeah,
make you think.
definitely.
Yeah, I think we'll probably have to follow up with WorkSafe and then keep or include that in our Q&A.
Yeah.
Yep,
But it's a good question though.
it's a great question. Yep. Okay, so let's move on to our final slide here. And what's next? Okay, so we would love for you to fill out our webinar series survey. So that's that QR code on the screen there. Simi will also put the link to the QR or to the survey in the chat. So please share your feedback with us via this 10-question survey. It shouldn't take you too long, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and how we can better serve you when it comes to any regulatory changes that occur in the future. So thank you in advance for that. Also, the next steps. So to train your staff on your new procedures. So remember, the workers, the first aid attendants, and any of those transportation assistants will need guidance from you. So set that expectation so they know how to exceed that expectation and make you proud in the face of an injury or medical emergency. And then test it, develop and conduct those drills. Remember, we can help you with that if you don't know where to start. So if you want to delegate that to your safety committee, they can also run the drill for you. We can provide support to them as well. So don't be afraid to request that first aid consultation or a committee drop-in. We're here to help. So remember to also register for one of the 3 first aid assessment workshops that we'll be hosting in the first 2 weeks of November here. I'll put the link to those in the chat here shortly. And then it's been a pleasure to spend this time with you the last couple of weeks here. And I really look forward to helping you and yeah, doing anything when it comes to this topic or others in the future. So we'll see you at the next webinar series, whenever that will be, and have a great day, everyone. And please remember the deadline for your new procedures is that November 1st deadline. So thanks again, and we look forward to working with you in the future and helping you out when it comes to new regulation and anything else health and safety.